It was a wretched thing to stand so near a god, that unloving, uncaring god, the void itself. Nicare Locke's third jaw of the umbrous clericalis clenched his jaw and felt bile scream through his pale throat. As all pure Astartes, his gut housed a superior organ, a venom sac of burning spit that welled, waiting for release if ever he was out of his armor. His armor, midnight-clad and thrice the height of any mortal. No scratch tarnished his paint, for Nicare was the untarnished, unscratched. This is why his name was so, why he carried that title. No blade nor bolter would ever fleck paint from his second, third skin. His acid ducts, it seemed, were to be perpetually full and waiting to be spat. He sat on his idle throne at the rest at the helm of the Nighthawk Nox Eternalis, Night Eternal, which itself was a sub-mechania component of the Night Lordship Nox Night, Night. Like all of the so-called traitorous warriors of the dark, Nox Night was an ancient, elegant vessel. It drifted midnight-clad with bronze and black detailing through the void, adrift without supplies, and yet boasted of a winning streak that would never fail. No one bested the hunters aboard Nox Night, only time itself, that fickle and facetious god-beast itself. Nicare would feast on it if he could. "Master, sir?" came a voice. Unis, his slave. He was a ratty, gnarled thing like all mortals were to Nicare's gene-boosted eyes. His face was matched with pores and thin hairs, his thin, pale lips perpetually pulled back and his nostrils flaring. He would have almost been handsome if Nicare had been capable of such knowledge, and if he wasn't a blind, ragged slave. Lord Anus seeks you." His voice quivered and shook. Nicare had turned off his vox for so long now as he stared into the abyss, watching as it stared back with hate. Hate he could match, hate that pounded through his veins and filled his teeth. "I know." Nicare grit his ceramite teeth, which could chew through anything, even his ceramite armor. It's the Wargiver, and the Festerer, they—" "I know," Nicare said. He removed his helm, which bore an elegant painting, a skull grinning, untouched, untarnished. What a legacy to bear, what a horrible burden, the weight of his Primarch, his gene-seed origin, his greatest aspiration. He spit on the floor, and it started to bubble. "It's too bright," growled the Wargiver. Of course, he was staring into the sun. In his own suit of wrecker warplate, the Wargiver dwarfed Anus, who in turn dwarfed the hundreds of slaves who manned panel after panel of screens on the Nox Night. On each of his shoulders was a skull, a real skull, to match the one painted across his grim helm. On the center of his breastplate was a skull, a solemn reminder of the role he held as liaison. On his back he wore an ornate cloak, fine to show his rank, yet woven of foul threads, the threads of life itself, mortal flesh, tanned into leather and sewn. Behind his cape, he had a second cape. This was a line of chains which held skulls and helms in alternating pattern that trailed after him like a bridal veil. With every step came the clanking of death itself on the ceramite floor. "You're staring at the sun," Anus said, smelling him. "Like murder itself." "The sun, yes. The sun itself. On ancient Terra, mortals used to worship it as a deity. They believed the sun was what brought stability. They knew hymns of rains and snows and saw the sun itself as a man who would save them before they thought the Emperor would, that vile bastard. Save them from themselves, save them from the night eternal. Man fears the dark. He screeches into the unknown, howls at the dark like an infant weaned too soon," the Wargiver mused. "And we are the dark that is howled at," Anus nodded. His battle plate was marred by scratches and wounds. Some saw this as a weakness, some marking of imperfection. How often he was hit by bolter fire, struck by chain swords and dark swords. How wrong they were. He was a bringer of his wounds, torturing himself to feel that adrenaline, that forbidden pain that marred his thoughts and helped him taste blood. He began to drool, a habit hid by his helm, which had left a streak down the side of his chin where even his perfect, reinforced skin had failed to his superior saliva. "I'm here." Nakare strode in through the ancient metal doors, which groaned from years of neglect, tearing the eardrums of the slaves and servitors nearby. "Where's the festerer?" He had his helm off. This revealed his shaved head, his black eyes perfected to see in the dark, if this room wasn't currently blazing like the sun it was directly next to. His features were warped by thousands of years of war and genetic perfection, which had long ago stripped that 10-year-old boy away. Yet he would have been quite handsome if he wasn't a chiseled elite killer instead. "I am here!" The command throne, which sat at the apex of the chamber, swirled. Atop it was the festerer, the helm of Nox Knight. The festerer licked his black lips with his black tongue, his features long twisted from his namesake. The fester, the dark deeds and impulses that had rooted into his mind like Abraxius Eritus. His battle plate, black, was painted with the sigil of a skull, morose. Years of being on his throne had warped him, turning him far more throne than man, if he ever was man to begin with. Brother soldier Mercutio was gone. Only the festerer remained. Now observe! A shake shattered through the ship with insane speed. Void War! They were in a damned Void War! Here, next to the sun. A risky maneuver the sanguine blood angels were never to expect. If the gambit would play, Nakare scowled. "Get a load of this guy," Anu said as he blink-clicked into a private vox of Nakare. "Show some respect, brother," Nakare reprimanded as Anu sent him pic after vid after gif in response. Festerer chuckled, which sounded like two lightning drills crashing into each other as the void outside exploded with fire. "Delicious," he thought, watching the Hyperion battle blade perform the Vendex maneuver, tearing like a shark through the operatic battle void. "Divine!" The gracious, first of the dark power Nexi to leave the Terris Incorpus Insiditus, had reigned over the sophoric sky for 10,000 years, but with this hair not turned the great beast would growl its last song at the blasts of the sword lasers. Festerer's breath smelled of rot, as did the sun outside as he cackled. He himself was large, massive, bigger than the Wargiver, and bigger than Anus and Nakare. Despite the rot that ate him from skin to bone, he had hints of handsome structure. His body, infused to the throne, was that of an ancient Terran fine art. Roman. "Stop this!" came a gruff voice as the whole doors slid open. There was a man in blood-red war paint, his lower helm purely made of clear ceramite, so all of his bloody teeth could be observed. There, the Blood Angels champion. Hurl? The Gruesome? "How can this be?" Nakare whispered over the vox. He stood almost 30 feet tall, dwarfing the Wargiver and even the Festerer, certainly Anus and Nakare. On each hand was extended his weapons, his claw glaives, each the size and shape of the old Terran traditional weapon of death, the scythe. Each dripped with machine blood, oily green wax that smelt like tar. Above him, rising 10 feet, was a rack of skulls, some still dripping human blood, thick red liquid that smelt of copper. On each shoulder were 3 skulls on top of each other, bashed and broken, and below them on white chains were the helms they had belonged to. Helms of note. Vex Adjunctus, the vile deceiver with his skull plate of mock tears in pastel blue. Umbrel Fortia, the legendary female, slain so long ago, so easily, by his scythes. Her mask was that of a woman's face, cast in ceramite, and then cast in pure gold. And then, Nakare. Nakare's skull and helm. Preemptive. Hurl grunted as his red eye plates glared down. "I will feast on your gene seed, unscathed one. I will tear it out of your throat and guzzle you down in one succulent bite. I have dreamt of this day since the dark wizard Magi dreamt of it 30,000 years ago. I have made your helm as I saw it on that day out of ceramite, as decoration, as a warning, as a reminder. Now it is time to feast!" He lunged at Nakare, his scythe ready to rip. Ceramite clashed with ceramite as he dug straight into Nakare's armor. Yet then he screamed. Nakare smirked. He too had access to the dark magic of the Eternal Wizards, but he had long ago chosen a different path. The path of not magi, but mages. The truer power, the wiser one, which had told him 40,000 years ago this day would happen, and had given him a long time to plan. Hurl's blades twisted into Nakare's battle armor, but what he hadn't known was that long ago Nakare had changed himself, become more powerful. A body was nothing when you had a battlesuit midnight clad. Long ago he had cut off that weak mortal part and replaced it with nothing. Nothing but his gut. His gut, full of the most powerful venom on Earth, which even now was tearing Hurl apart. For what Hurl could not have known was that Nakare had once visited Decadus Prime, the planet at the heart of the Willishwan Nebula, in the prison penal colony machine camp Low. Decadus Prime, the planet at the heart of the Willishwan Nebula, on the prison penal colony machine camp Low, where Hurl's treasured blades had been made, were to be made 10,000 years in the future. Nakare had altered the plans, knowing this day would come. His change was simple. He made those scythes a straw. A straw which now drunk up Nakare's venom and delivered them straight to Hurl the Gruesome, killing him slowly. Rage filled his ducts, pushed through his pores as he screamed, his insides melting, his outsides melting, all of his twisted and bubbling, squeezing and squelching until he was a goo, and yet still in that goo the valves of his armor kept him alive, suffering, crying, screaming, yet he could not scream, for long ago his 3 lungs had popped. As the void war outside raged, Nakare smirked and stepped out of the scythes as he watched his prey die. He reached down and lapped at the remains, tasting the pain he'd caused. "Looks like your gene seed is mine, gruesome," he intoned. Such was the way of grim, horrid gods. Such was the way of man. He was not a man. He was a god. A man who was now a god. And grim he was. This god. This god. This god of war. Hammer.